Some folks spend their whole lives waiting for someone to see their worth. Henrietta Bloom knew that feeling better than most. At 35, she was the forgotten woman in Sweetwater, the spinster who ran the bookshop and cared for her dying father, while the town whispered she was too plain, too old, too late for love. Then came the night of the harvest ball. When millionaire rancher Colt Carrigan walked into that hall, he could have chosen any woman. Instead, he asked Henrietta to dance. Not just once, but every single dance, until the candles burned low. The whole town watched in shock as the richest man for miles treated her like she was precious. That night changed everything for a woman who thought her chance at happiness had passed her by. But why did he choose her when he could have had anyone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sweetwater's dusty main street, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Henrietta Bloom pushed open the door to Hawkins' General Store, the familiar creak of hinges announcing her arrival to the world. In the back corner, tucked between barrels of flour and bolts of calico, sat her father's bookshop, a cramped alcove that had become her entire universe. She ran her fingers along the spine of her father's leather journal, worn smooth by years of handling. Thomas Bloom had been a quiet man who saw the world differently than most folks in Sweetwater. His journal was filled with observations about people, little sketches of their hands when they were nervous, notes about the way Mrs. Henderson's voice softened when she spoke of her late husband, or how young Timothy Fletcher's eyes lit up when he talked about horses. "People ain't what they seem on the surface, Henrietta," he'd told her countless times. "The heart's got layers, like an onion. Most folks only see the outer skin." Now, 3 months after laying him to rest in the town cemetery, Henrietta understood the weight of his words more than ever. The townspeople had decided long ago what she was: a plain spinster, a woman who'd missed her chance, someone to be pitied or ignored. But her father had seen something else entirely. "Miss Bloom, you got anything new come in?" Old Pete Morrison shuffled into the alcove, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he reached for his weekly penny dreadful. "Just got a shipment from Denver," Henrietta replied, her voice gentle but distant. "There's a new adventure story about railroad men, and Mrs. Fletcher sent over some romance novels," she finished. Pete's eyes twinkled. "Them romance stories ain't for an old goat like me, but I reckon they keep the ladies entertained." Henrietta managed a small smile. Pete was one of the few people in town who treated her with genuine kindness. Most others spoke to her only when necessity demanded it, their voices carrying that particular tone reserved for spinsters and charity cases. "How much for the railroad story?" Pete asked. "Take it," Henrietta said, pressing the book into his gnarled hands. "Papa always said stories should go where they're appreciated." Pete's expression softened. "Your daddy was a good man, Miss Bloom. Don't let nobody tell you different." After Pete left, Henrietta settled behind the small wooden counter her father had built with his own hands. She opened his journal to a page marked with a pressed wildflower, something he'd written about her just weeks before he passed. "My Henrietta sees the world with a poet's eyes," the entry read. "She finds beauty in broken things, hope in forgotten places. This town don't deserve such a heart, but maybe someday someone will come along who recognizes the treasure hiding in plain sight." The bell above the general store's front door chimed, and Henrietta looked up to see Margaret Ashford sweeping in with her usual air of superiority. Margaret ran the town's social calendar with an iron fist, deciding who was worthy of inclusion and who should remain on the margins. "Oh, Henrietta," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I was just telling the ladies at the quilting circle about the harvest ball next week. Such a lovely event for our eligible young people." The emphasis on young wasn't lost on Henrietta. At 35, she was well past what Sweetwater considered marriageable age. Margaret continued browsing the general store's wares, but her voice carried clearly to the bookshop. Of course, everyone's invited, but I do hope people will dress appropriately. We wouldn't want anyone to embarrass themselves or make the other guests uncomfortable. Henrietta's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on her father's journal. Margaret's message was crystal clear. Women like Henrietta should know their place and not attempt to rise above their station. The widow Patterson's been working on a lovely blue dress for weeks, Margaret continued, her voice growing louder. Such a shame. When ladies of a certain age try too hard to recapture their youth, it's rather unseemly. The cruelty in Margaret's tone cut deep. Henrietta had indeed commissioned Mrs. Patterson to alter one of her mother's old gowns, a sapphire blue silk that had been stored in her trunk for 20 years. She'd been planning to wear it to the harvest ball, her one attempt to step outside the shadows and feel beautiful for a single evening. After Margaret left with her purchases and her poisonous words, Henrietta sat in the silence of the bookshop, surrounded by stories of adventure and romance that felt as distant as the moon. She thought about her father's funeral, how the whole town had turned out to pay their respects to the poor spinster daughter left behind. Their sympathy had felt hollow, tinged with relief that they weren't in her position. The afternoon dragged on with few customers. Henrietta organized the shelves, dusted the sparse inventory, and counted the meager earnings from the day's sales. The bookshop barely brought in enough to cover her modest needs, but it was all she had left of her father's legacy. As evening approached, she pulled her shawl tight and prepared to close up shop. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, a melancholy reminder that another day had passed in her quiet, unremarkable life. Walking home to the small cottage she'd inherited, Henrietta passed groups of young women chattering excitedly about the upcoming ball. They spoke of dance cards and dress fittings, of hoping to catch the eye of one of the county's eligible bachelors. Their laughter followed her down the dusty street, a painful reminder of dreams she'd long since abandoned. At home, she lit a single lamp and sat at her kitchen table with her father's journal. She turned to a blank page and picked up his old fountain pen, thinking of what he might have written about her day. Instead, she found herself writing her own thoughts for the first time since he'd passed. "Some days I wonder if I've become invisible," she wrote in careful script. "The town sees me as a fixture, like the old oak by the church or the weathered signpost at the crossroads. I serve my purpose, keeping Papa's books organized, minding my own business, causing no trouble. But sometimes, late at night, I remember what it felt like to dream of something more." She paused, her pen hovering over the page. In the lamplight, shadows danced across the walls like memories of all the evenings she'd spent caring for her father as his health declined. Those had been hard years, but they'd also been filled with love and purpose. Now, with him gone, she struggled to find meaning in the quiet routine of her days. The ladies whisper that I'm past my prime, that I missed my chance for marriage and family. Maybe they're right. Maybe 35 is too old to hope for love. But Papa always said the heart don't age the same way the body does. He said some flowers bloom late in the season and turn out to be the most beautiful of all. A knock at her door interrupted her writing. Henrietta set down the pen and went to answer it, surprised to find Mrs. Patterson standing on her doorstep with a large bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Evening, dear," the elderly seamstress said with a warm smile. "I finished your dress for the ball. Thought you might like to see it before the big night." Henrietta's heart sank, remembering Margaret's cutting remarks about women of a certain age making fools of themselves. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm not sure I should." "Nonsense," the older woman interrupted, pushing her way into the cottage. "Your mother was the most elegant woman in 3 counties, and this dress was her pride and joy. Let's see how it looks on you." Despite her reservations, Henrietta found herself being gently bullied into trying on the gown. Mrs. Patterson had worked miracles with the 20-year-old silk, taking it in at the waist and updating the sleeves to be more flattering. When Henrietta looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The sapphire blue brought out the warm brown of her eyes and complemented her auburn hair. The cut of the dress emphasized her graceful neck and the gentle curve of her waist. For just a moment, she could see what her father had always insisted was there a quiet beauty that had nothing to do with youth or fashion, but everything to do with character and grace. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. "You look just like your mother did on her wedding day. She'd be so proud." But as quickly as the moment of confidence came, it faded. Henrietta imagined walking into the harvest ball in this dress, facing the stares and whispers of the townspeople. She pictured Margaret's smug satisfaction at seeing the old spinster trying so desperately to be noticed. "I can't wear this," Henrietta said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's too much." Mrs. Patterson took her hands firmly. "Henrietta Bloom, you listen to me. I've been making dresses in this town for 40 years, and I know beauty when I see it. You have every right to walk into that ball with your head held high. Don't let small-minded people convince you otherwise." After Mrs. Patterson left, Henrietta hung the dress carefully in her wardrobe and returned to her father's journal. She read through his entries about the townspeople, noting how he'd seen past their facades to the hopes and fears beneath. He'd written about Margaret's desperate need to feel important, about the young women's anxiety over finding husbands, about the men's struggles to provide for their families in an unforgiving land. "Everyone's fighting their own battles," he'd noted. "The ones who are meanest are usually the ones hurting most." As the clock chimed 9, Henrietta made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her. She took out a sheet of her best writing paper and began composing a letter to her cousin Sarah in Denver, the one person who'd always believed in her worth. "Dearest Sarah," she wrote, "I know it's been too long since we've corresponded, but I find myself in need of your wisdom. There's to be a ball here next week, and for the first time in years, I'm considering attending. Papa always said I had something special to offer the world, but I confess I'm struggling to believe it myself. What would you do if you were in my place?" She sealed the letter, knowing it would be too late to receive a reply before the ball. But the act of reaching out, of admitting her uncertainty to someone who cared about her, felt like the first brave thing she'd done since her father's passing. Outside her window, the stars shone bright over Sweetwater, the same stars that had watched over her parents' courtship and her own quiet childhood. Tomorrow would bring another day of whispers and sideways glances, another day of feeling invisible in her own hometown. But tonight, for just a few moments, Henrietta allowed herself to imagine a different possibility, one where a woman's worth wasn't measured by her age or her marital status, but by the depth of her heart and the strength of her spirit. The sapphire dress hung in her wardrobe like a promise, waiting to see if she would find the courage to keep it. The morning of the harvest ball dawned crisp and clear, with golden leaves dancing on the autumn breeze. Henrietta stood at her kitchen window, watching the town come alive with preparations for the evening's festivities. Wagons rolled past carrying tables and chairs, while women hurried by with arms full of flowers and bunting. She'd barely slept, her mind churning between excitement and dread about her decision to attend. The sapphire dress hung like a beacon of hope or folly in her wardrobe, waiting for her final choice. Around noon, a commotion outside drew her attention. A magnificent black stallion was tied to the hitching post in front of the general store, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian. The horse wore the finest leather tack Henrietta had ever seen, with silver buckles that caught the sunlight like stars. "Well, I'll be damned," she heard Pete Morrison mutter as he stopped to admire the animal. "Ain't seen horseflesh like that since the governor came through." Henrietta's curiosity got the better of her, and she made her way to the general store under the pretense of checking on the bookshop. Inside, she found the usual crowd gathered around a tall stranger examining bolts of fabric with surprising attention to detail. The man commanded the room without saying a word. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard work despite the fine cut of his clothes. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and when he turned slightly, Henrietta caught a glimpse of a strong jawline and eyes the colour of storm clouds. Colt Carrigan, he introduced himself to Mr. Hawkins, extending a hand that bore the calluses of a working man despite the expensive gold signet ring on his pinky finger. The name sent a ripple of recognition through the gathered townspeople. Carrigan owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, with holdings that stretched from the Colorado border to the Arkansas River. Rumors of his wealth had reached even sleepy Sweetwater, though no one expected to see him in their humble store. "Looking for something particular, Mr. Carrigan?" Hawkins asked, his voice carrying the eager tone of a man scenting profit. "My housekeeper mentioned your wife makes fine pies for special occasions," Colt replied, his voice carrying a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. "I was hoping to commission something for tonight's festivities." "Mrs." Hawkins practically glowed with pride. "Why, certainly. Apple, peach, or berry." "All 3, Colt said without hesitation. "And perhaps you could recommend a lady who might need an escort to the ball. I find myself without suitable company for the evening." The suggestion sent a shockwave through the store. Every unmarried woman within 50 miles would have fought for the privilege of attending the harvest ball on Colt Carrigan's arm. Margaret Ashford, who'd been hovering near the ribbon display, immediately stepped forward. "My niece Clara would be delighted," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "She's just 17, fresh as a spring morning, and accomplished at piano." "Very kind," Colt replied politely, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't interested in spring mornings or piano accomplishments. His gaze swept the store, passing over the eager faces of several young women before settling on Henrietta, who'd been trying to blend into the shadows near the bookshop. Their eyes met for just a moment, but it was enough to send heat rushing to Henrietta's cheeks. She looked away quickly, pretending to organize books that were already perfectly arranged. "Actually," Colt said, his voice carrying clearly across the store, "I'm more interested in intelligent conversation than musical talents. Perhaps there's a lady in town who appreciates literature?" Henrietta's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't possibly think he was referring to her, could she? Margaret's laugh carried a sharp edge. "Oh, Mr. Carrigan, you'd want someone who could appreciate your fine company. Perhaps Mrs. Fletcher's eldest daughter, Rachel? She reads sometimes." But Colt had already moved toward the bookshop, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Henrietta felt trapped, acutely aware of every eye in the store following his progress. "Quite a collection," he observed, scanning the modest shelves. "Do you have a recommendation for someone interested in frontier history?" Henrietta's throat felt dry as dust. "There's a new volume about the cattle trails," she managed, "written by a Texas rancher who actually rode them." "You've read it?" "Yes, sir. Papa, my father, always said you couldn't recommend a book you hadn't read yourself." Colt pulled the book from the shelf, his fingers brushing hers as she reached to help. The brief contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. She noticed he wore a silver pocket watch, its chain catching the light. The timepiece looked expensive but well worn, with initials engraved on the case that she couldn't quite make out. "Your father sounds like a wise man," Colt said softly. "What did he think of this particular author's perspective?" The question surprised Henrietta. Most people in Sweetwater had never bothered to ask her opinion about anything more substantial than the weather. "He said the man understood that history ain't just about the big events, but about the small choices ordinary people make when times get hard." "And what do you think?" Henrietta glanced around the store, acutely aware that their conversation was being dissected by every person present. "I think most folks are braver than they know, when they have to be." Something shifted in Colt's expression. His storm-grey eyes seemed to see past her plain brown dress and carefully pinned hair to something deeper. "I believe you're right about that." He purchased the book, along with 2 others she recommended, paying with gold coins that gleamed in his palm. As he prepared to leave, Margaret practically threw herself into his path. "Mr. Carrigan, surely you'll reconsider about Clara. She's such a lovely girl, and her mother was quite the belle in her day." "I'm sure she's charming," Colt replied, but his gaze drifted back to Henrietta. However, I prefer to make my own choices about such matters. After he left, the store buzzed with speculation. Margaret's face was pinched with frustration, while the younger women whispered about missed opportunities and unfair advantages. "Did you see how he looked at her?" someone murmured. And Henrietta knew they meant her. "Probably just being polite," Margaret sniffed. "Men like that don't seriously consider women of certain circumstances." Henrietta fled to the safety of her cottage, her mind reeling from the encounter. She tried to convince herself that she'd imagined the interest in Colt's eyes, that his questions had been mere politeness. But the memory of his voice, saying her thoughts about bravery were right, kept echoing in her mind. That evening, as she stood before her mirror in the sapphire gown, Henrietta made a decision that would have shocked her father and terrified her younger self. She was going to the harvest ball, not because she expected anything to come of it, but because she was tired of being invisible, tired of letting fear make her choices. The silver pocket watch's brief glint had stirred something in her memory, a story her father once told about a young rancher who'd lost everything in a terrible accident, who'd built his fortune back from nothing but determination and heartache. Could Colt Carrigan be carrying secrets of his own behind those storm-grey eyes? As she walked toward the community hall, her heart pounding with every step, Henrietta couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything. The autumn stars shone overhead, and the sound of fiddle music drifted through the crisp air, calling her toward a future she'd never dared to imagine. Behind her, the cottage stood empty, for the first time since her father's funeral, a fitting symbol of a woman finally ready to step out of the shadows and into the light. The community hall glowed with warm lamplight as Henrietta approached, her sapphire gown rustling softly with each careful step. Through the tall windows she could see couples already dancing to the lively tune of fiddles and a piano. Her courage nearly failed her at the threshold, but the memory of her father's words about late blooming flowers gave her strength to push open the heavy wooden doors. A hush fell over the nearest dancers as she entered. Henrietta felt every gaze like a physical weight, some curious, others openly disapproving. Margaret Ashford's mouth formed a perfect circle of shock before quickly twisting into a smirk. "Well," Margaret said to Mrs. Fletcher in a voice meant to carry, "some people certainly have interesting ideas about appropriate attire." But Henrietta barely heard the cutting remark. Her attention was captured by a familiar figure standing near the refreshment table, Colt Carrigan, looking devastatingly handsome in a black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding presence. He held a glass of punch, but his eyes were scanning the room with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for what he wanted. When his gaze found hers, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. A slow smile spread across his face, and he set down his glass with deliberate purpose. The crowd parted before him like water as he crossed the room, his intent clear to everyone present. "Miss Bloom," he said, offering a formal bow that belonged more to a grand ballroom than a frontier dance hall. "You look absolutely beautiful this evening." Heat flooded Henrietta's cheeks. "Mr. Carrigan, I thank you. Would you do me the honor of this dance?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Around them, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Young women who'd been preening for his attention stood frozen in disbelief. Clara Ashford's face crumpled with disappointment, while her Aunt Margaret looked as though she'd swallowed something particularly bitter. "I'm not much of a dancer," Henrietta whispered, acutely aware of the dozens of ears straining to catch her words. "Neither am I," Colt replied with a gentle smile that transformed his rugged features. "We'll figure it out together." He offered his arm with such easy confidence that Henrietta found herself accepting before her doubts could resurface. As they moved onto the dance floor, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the hall's mirror, a woman she barely recognized, standing beside the most sought-after man in 3 counties. The fiddles struck up a waltz, and Colt's hand settled at her waist with surprising gentleness. His other hand engulfed hers, warm and slightly rough, from years of ranch work despite his obvious wealth. As they began to move, Henrietta discovered that dancing with the right partner was like breathing natural and effortless. "You're doing beautifully," Colt murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I feel like I'm in someone else's dream," Henrietta admitted, then immediately regretted such a revealing statement. Whose dream would that be? She met his eyes, finding genuine interest there rather than the polite smile she expected. "The girl I used to be, before I learned to be practical about such things." And what did that girl dream about? The question was asked so seriously that Henrietta found herself answering honestly. Dancing with a handsome stranger who saw something worthwhile in her. Being the kind of woman who belonged in beautiful dresses and candlelit rooms. That girl sounds wise. What happened to her? Life, Henrietta said simply. Responsibility. The understanding that some dreams are for other people. Colt spun her gently, and when she came back into his arms, his expression had grown thoughtful. "I've found that the dreams we give up too easily are often the ones worth fighting for." Before Henrietta could respond, the waltz ended, but instead of escorting her from the floor, Colt kept her hand firmly in his. Another? Around them, other couples were changing partners, following the social convention that no gentleman should monopolize a lady's entire dance card. But Colt seemed oblivious to convention, and Henrietta found she didn't care about propriety when his attention made her feel so alive. They danced 3 more sets before taking a brief respite by the windows. Colt procured glasses of lemonade, positioning himself so that his broad frame shielded Henrietta from the worst of the stares and whispers. "You're causing quite a scandal," Henrietta observed, nodding toward a cluster of ladies whose heads were bent together in animated gossip. "Good," Colt said with such firmness that Henrietta looked at him in surprise. "Sometimes scandals are necessary to shake people out of their narrow thinking." "You don't know what it's like living in a town like this," Henrietta protested. "Tomorrow I'll still be here, and they'll still remember every minute of tonight." "Will that change how you felt during our dances?" The question stopped her short. "No," she admitted. "Nothing could change that." "Then the rest doesn't matter." His certainty was both thrilling and terrifying. Henrietta had spent so many years making herself small, avoiding attention, that his bold disregard for others' opinions felt like stepping too close to a flame. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, seeking safer ground. A shadow passed across Colt's features so quickly she might have imagined it. "It's a working cattle operation, nothing too exciting for a lady who appreciates literature. My father always said that any honest work has its own nobility. I'd like to hear about it." For a moment, Colt seemed to struggle with something internal. His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket watch, fingers tracing its outline through the fabric of his vest. "Perhaps sometime," he said finally. "But tonight is for dancing, not talking about cattle and endless chores." The fiddles struck up another tune, and Colt offered his arm once again. As they returned to the dance floor, Henrietta caught sight of Margaret Ashford in deep conversation with several of the town's most influential wives. Their expressions promised trouble, but for the first time in her adult life, Henrietta found she didn't care. Dancing with Colt, she felt beautiful, desired, worthy of attention. His hand at her waist was steady and sure, his lead confident without being forceful. When he looked at her, she saw reflected in his eyes the woman she'd always hoped she could be: graceful, interesting, deserving of romance. "You're smiling," Colt observed, as they moved through the steps of a Scottish reel. "I can't seem to help it," Henrietta confessed. "I feel like Cinderella at the ball." And what happens to Cinderella when the clock strikes midnight? The question sent a chill through her borrowed confidence. She goes back to being nobody special. Colt's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Only if she chooses to. Some spells, Miss Bloom, aren't meant to be broken." As the evening progressed, Henrietta began to understand that she was witnessing something unprecedented in Sweetwater's social history. Colt Carrigan, who could have had his pick of any woman in the territory, had chosen to spend his entire evening with the town spinster. The implications rippled through the hall like stones thrown into still water. But with each dance, each shared smile, each moment of conversation, Henrietta found herself caring less about the town's reaction and more about the mystery of the man who'd transformed her evening into something magical. As the clock neared 10, the musicians took a brief respite and couples began to drift toward the refreshment tables. Henrietta found herself surrounded by a strange new reality. Everywhere she looked, people were staring, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed resentment, but all with the acute awareness that something significant was happening. Colt remained at her side, his presence both protective and proprietary. When Margaret Ashford approached with Clara in tow, Henrietta felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. "Mr. Carrigan," Margaret said with saccharine sweetness, "surely you'd like to meet some of our other lovely ladies. Clara here has been simply dying to make your acquaintance." Clara stepped forward with a practiced curtsy, her yellow dress and carefully arranged ringlets the picture of youthful perfection. At 17, she possessed the kind of fresh beauty that made men forget their own names, and her shy smile had broken hearts from Denver to Santa Fe. "Miss Clara," Colt acknowledged politely, offering a brief nod. "You look lovely this evening." Clara's cheeks pinked prettily. "Thank you, Mr. Carrigan. Aunt Margaret tells me you have the finest horses in Colorado. I do so love to ride." "Riding is a useful skill in this country," Colt agreed, but his tone remained cordially distant. Margaret pressed on with the determination of a general mounting an assault. "Clara has won 3 blue ribbons at the county fair for her horsemanship, and her needlework, why, the Reverend's wife says she's never seen finer stitching." "Impressive accomplishments," Colt said, though Henrietta noticed his hand had found its way to his pocket watch again, fingers drumming against the silver case with barely contained impatience. "Perhaps you'd honor Clara with a dance," Margaret suggested, with the confidence of a woman accustomed to getting her way. The request hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Henrietta felt her heart sink, understanding that this was the moment her fairy tale would end. Of course, Colt would dance with Clara. What man wouldn't choose youth and beauty over a faded spinster pushing 40? But instead of offering his arm to the young woman, Colt turned to Henrietta with a slight smile. "Actually, Miss Bloom has promised me the next several dances. Haven't you?" "Miss Bloom?" Henrietta's breath caught. She hadn't promised any such thing, but the warmth in Colt's eyes made her nod mutely. Margaret's expression shifted from confident expectation to shocked outrage in the span of a heartbeat. "Surely one dance with Clara wouldn't be too much to ask," Margaret persisted, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "After all, Miss Bloom will understand that a gentleman must be gracious to all the ladies present." "I believe Miss Bloom understands that a gentleman's first obligation is to his chosen partner," Colt replied firmly. "And I've chosen to spend my evening in her company." The words hit Margaret like a slap, her face flushed red above her high collar, and for a moment Henrietta thought the older woman might actually strike someone. Clara looked between the adults with growing confusion, clearly unaccustomed to being dismissed so definitively. "Well," Margaret huffed, gathering her skirts with theatrical indignation, "I suppose some people have no appreciation for quality or breeding." "You're absolutely right," Colt said, with such pleasant agreement that it took Margaret a moment to realize she'd been insulted. "Some people are too shallow to recognize true worth when it's standing right in front of them." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish before she spun away, dragging poor Clara behind her. Henrietta watched them go with a mixture of triumph and terror. "You've made an enemy tonight," she warned softly. "I've made several, I suspect," Colt replied, seemingly unconcerned. "But I've also made a friend, and that's worth far more." The musicians returned, striking up a gentle waltz that drew couples back onto the floor. As they moved through the familiar steps, Henrietta found herself studying Colt's face in the lamplight. His features were strong but not harsh, with lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as much as weather and worry. "May I ask you something?" she ventured. "Anything. Why did you really come to Sweetwater? A man with your means could attend balls in Denver or Colorado Springs. Surely you didn't ride all this way for Mrs. Hawkins' pies." Colt's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "What makes you think I had other motives? The way you looked around the store today, like you were searching for something specific. And your pocket watch." She hesitated, not wanting to seem presumptuous. "What about my watch? It looks old, meaningful, like something with a story." Colt was quiet for so long that Henrietta began to regret her curiosity. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "It belonged to my brother. He died 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Henrietta said immediately. "I shouldn't have." "No, it's all right. You're very observant." He spun her gently, and when she came back into his arms, his expression had grown distant. "Thomas always said I'd know the right woman when I found someone who could see past the surface to what really mattered." The name sent a jolt through Henrietta's memory. Thomas, my younger brother. He was the dreamer in the family, always believed in happy endings and true love. Foolish notions, most people would say. Henrietta's mind raced. Her father's name had been Thomas, and he'd spoken often about seeing past surfaces to the heart beneath. Could it be mere coincidence, or was there some connection she couldn't yet understand? "What did he look like?" she asked quietly. Colt's brow furrowed at the odd question. Tall like me, but leaner, brown hair, gentle hands. He had a way of making people feel comfortable, like they could tell him anything. His voice softened with memory. He kept a journal, wrote down his thoughts about people and places. Said everyone had a story worth telling if you took the time to listen. The description made Henrietta's pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. "He sounds like a remarkable man." He was. The ranch was his idea, he said. We needed somewhere to start fresh, away from the past. Colt's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I've been trying to honor his memory by building the life he dreamed of." As they continued dancing, Henrietta's thoughts churned with possibilities. The coincidences were too numerous to ignore the name, the journal, the gentle philosophy that sounded exactly like something her father would have said. But how could she ask such questions without seeming mad? The evening was taking on a dreamlike quality, as if the normal rules of her careful, predictable world had been suspended. Dancing with the most eligible man for miles, while the whole town watched, was unlikely enough. But the possibility that this encounter might be connected to her father's mysterious past seemed beyond the realm of possibility. As the evening wore on, the social divide in the community hall became increasingly apparent. On one side clustered the families who'd been watching Colt and Henrietta's extended dance partnership with growing disapproval. Margaret Ashford held court like a general planning a siege, her voice carrying clearly across the room as she questioned the propriety of a man monopolizing one woman's entire evening. On the other side, a smaller group had gathered older couples who remembered what it was like to be young and smitten, widows who understood the loneliness of unfulfilled dreams, and a few brave souls who'd always thought Henrietta deserved better than the town's casual cruelty. Old Pete Morrison raised his glass of punch when Henrietta and Colt waltzed past. "About time someone recognized quality when they saw it," he called out, earning a sharp look from Margaret. But it was Dr. Harrison's quiet observation to his wife that reached Henrietta's ears and made her heart flutter. "Haven't seen that girl smile like that since her mother was alive. Reminds me how beautiful she was as a child, before life taught her to hide her light." As the clock struck 11, the musicians announced the final set of dances. Colt led Henrietta to a quieter corner of the hall, near the windows where autumn moonlight filtered through the glass. "Walk with me?" he asked softly. Henrietta glanced around the room, acutely aware of the eyes still following their every movement. "People will talk. People are already talking. The question is whether you care more about their opinions or your own happiness." It was the kind of direct challenge Henrietta had never faced before. Her entire life had been built around avoiding gossip, staying invisible, keeping peace. But tonight, wrapped in her mother's sapphire gown and feeling beautiful for the first time in decades, she found her answer. "My happiness," she said firmly. Colt's smile was radiant. "Then let's give them something worth discussing." He led her through the hall's side door onto a covered porch that overlooked the town's main street. The night air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Henrietta pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. Colt immediately shrugged out of his coat and draped it around her, the gesture so natural and protective that her throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, breathing in the scent of leather and cedar that clung to the fine wool. "Thomas would have liked you," Colt said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. "He always said the best people were the ones who'd been tested by hardship and chose kindness anyway." The mention of his brother sent another jolt through Henrietta's memory. "Colt, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm being presumptuous." "Ask away." "Your brother's journal, did he ever mention a man named Thomas Bloom?" Colt went very still. "Why would you ask that?" Henrietta's heart pounded as she took the leap into truth. "Because Thomas Bloom was my father, and everything you've told me about your brother sounds exactly like him." For a long moment, Colt said nothing. Then he reached into his vest and withdrew the silver pocket watch, opening it to reveal an inscription on the inner case. In the moonlight, Henrietta could just make out the words, "For my brother Colt, may you find what you're looking for. T.B. Thomas Bloom," Colt said quietly. "Tom Carrigan. Same man, different names." The revelation hit Henrietta like a physical blow. "You're saying my father was your brother?" "I'm saying the man who raised you was the brother I'd been searching for since the war ended." Colt's voice was thick with emotion. "He disappeared after Gettysburg. We thought he was dead. There was an explosion, bodies everywhere, impossible to identify. I've been looking for any trace of him for 20 years. Henrietta's mind reeled. Her gentle, bookish father had been a soldier, had lived an entirely different life before coming to Sweetwater. He never spoke of the war, never mentioned having a brother. He wouldn't have. Tom was trying to forget everything about our past. Colt closed the watch with a soft click. Our family had money, position, everything the world said should matter. But it was built on things Tom couldn't stomach: slave labor, exploitation, cruelty disguised as business. So he left. We both left eventually, but Tom was braver. He walked away first, changed his name, started over with nothing but his principles intact. Colt's voice held deep admiration mixed with old grief. I was too much of a coward. Stayed and tried to change things from the inside until it nearly destroyed me. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. And you came to Sweetwater looking for him. I hired investigators last year. They traced Thomas Bloom to this town, found records of his death 3 months ago. Colt turned to face her fully. I came here to see where he'd lived, maybe find someone who knew him, who could tell me if he'd been happy. And instead you found me. I found his daughter, a woman who has his eyes, his gentle heart, his way of seeing the best in people even when they don't deserve it. Tears spilled down Henrietta's cheeks as the magnitude of this revelation settled over her. All those years I thought he had no family, that we were alone in the world. You were never alone, Colt said fiercely. Tom wrote about you in his journal constantly. How proud he was, how much he loved you, how worried he was about leaving you unprotected. You have his journal? Among other things, letters he never sent, drawings he made, stories about your childhood that made me feel like I knew you before we ever met. Colt reached out tentatively and wiped a tear from her cheek. He wrote that you were the finest thing he'd ever accomplished, that watching you grow into a woman of character was his greatest joy. The knowledge that her father had documented their life together, had shared their bond with the brother she'd never known existed, was both heartbreaking and healing. All those quiet evenings when he'd seemed lost in thought, he'd been missing the family he'd left behind. Why didn't you tell me who you were when we met in the store? How could I walk up to a grieving woman and announce that her father had been living under an assumed name, that everything she thought she knew about her family was incomplete? Colt shook his head. I needed to know you first, to understand what kind of person you were. Tom wrote that you were special, but I needed to see it myself. And what did you see? A woman worth dancing with all night, Colt said simply. Someone who makes me understand why Tom loved this quiet life he built. Someone who reminds me that the best things in life aren't bought or conquered, they're recognized and cherished. Inside the hall, the final waltz was ending, and couples were beginning to gather their wraps and prepare for the journey home. But on the moonlit porch, Henrietta felt like she was standing at the beginning of a new chapter rather than the end of an evening. The revelation about her father's true identity left Henrietta feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted permanently. As Colt escorted her home through the quiet streets of Sweetwater, her mind churned with questions that had no easy answers. All those times he seemed melancholy, she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. I thought he was just missing my mother. But he was grieving for the brother he'd left behind, wasn't he? Colt nodded, his expression pained. Tom always carried guilt about disappearing without word. But after what we'd both seen in the war, what we'd learned about our family's business practices, he felt he had no choice but to start completely over. They paused at her garden gate, neither wanting the evening to end despite the weight of these revelations. The cottage looked smaller somehow in the moonlight, as if learning about her father's hidden past had changed even the familiar boundaries of her world. Would you like to see his journal? Henrietta asked suddenly. Are you certain? Those thoughts were meant to be private. He's gone, and you're the only family I have left. The words came out more vulnerably than she'd intended. Maybe you'll understand things about him that I missed. Inside the modest parlour, Henrietta lit a lamp, while Colt examined the simple furnishings with the reverence of a man visiting a shrine. His eyes lingered on the well-worn books, the carefully mended furniture, the evidence of a life lived with dignity despite limited means. He was happy here, Colt observed, running his fingers along the spine of a volume of poetry. I can feel it in this room. Henrietta retrieved her father's journal from the kitchen table, where it still lay open to her own recent entry. As she handed it to Colt, their fingers touched briefly, sending warmth shooting up her arm despite the evening's emotional turmoil. Colt opened the journal carefully, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting with visible emotion. His penmanship hasn't changed, he murmured, always so precise, so thoughtful. He read silently for several minutes, while Henrietta fidgeted nervously, second-guessing her decision to share something so personal. Finally, Colt looked up with tears glistening in his eyes. Listen to this, he said, his voice rough with emotion. He wrote this just 2 weeks before he died. Watched Henrietta organizing the books today and saw her mother's grace in every movement. She doesn't know how beautiful she is, inside and out. My greatest fear is that I'll leave her alone in a world that doesn't appreciate gentle souls. She deserves someone who will see her worth, who will love her with the same fierce protection her mother and I have always felt. Henrietta's breath caught. He never told me he worried about that. There's more. Colt turned the page carefully. Sometimes I dream that Colt finds his way to this peaceful place. He was always the stronger of us, but strength without purpose can be a terrible burden. If he ever reads these words, I hope he'll understand that leaving our old life was the only way I could become the man Henrietta's mother deserved, the father my daughter needed. The weight of her father's unspoken hopes settled over the small room like a benediction. Henrietta sank into her favorite chair, overwhelmed by the idea that her father had somehow foreseen this moment, had hoped for a connection that seemed impossible until tonight. He knew, she whispered. Somehow he knew. Colt continued reading, sharing passages that painted a picture of Thomas Bloom's quiet contentment in his chosen exile. But underneath the peaceful descriptions of daily life, Henrietta began to detect something else. Subtle references to watching for strangers, careful notes about people who asked too many questions, an underlying vigilance that spoke of old fears never quite laid to rest. "Was he afraid of something?" she asked. Colt's expression darkened. "Our family's business attracted dangerous men. Tom testified against some of them before he disappeared. Federal investigators trying to break up a network of war profiteers, and worse. There were threats, attempts to silence him. You think someone might have followed him here? I don't know. But I hired those investigators to trace him, and if I could find a trail after 20 years, others might have too." Colt closed the journal gently. "Tom mentions a few incidents in here, strangers asking about him in town, someone going through his papers at the store. He was being careful." The implications sent a chill through Henrietta. "Do you think that's why he never told me about his past? To protect me?" "Tom always protected the people he loved, sometimes at his own expense." Colt moved to the window, peering out at the quiet street with the wariness of a man accustomed to watching for trouble. "The question is whether that protection ended with his death." Before Henrietta could respond, a soft knock at the front door made them both freeze. It was nearly midnight, far too late for social calls in a town like Sweetwater. "Stay here," Colt instructed quietly, moving toward the door with surprising stealth for such a large man. But the voice that called through the wooden panels belonged to Margaret Ashford, and it carried the righteous indignation of a woman on a mission. "Henrietta Bloom, I know you're in there, and I know that man is with you. This behavior is absolutely scandalous, and I won't stand by while you make a mockery of decent society." Henrietta's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but Colt's expression had grown thunderous. "Let me handle this," he said grimly. He opened the door with such sudden force that Margaret stumbled backward, clearly expecting to find Henrietta cowering behind the panels. Instead, she faced 6 feet of irritated male authority, and her bluster faltered momentarily. "Mr. Carrigan," she said, rallying quickly, "surely a gentleman of your standing understands the impropriety of being alone with an unmarried woman at this hour." "What I understand, madam, is that Miss Bloom's reputation is being attacked by someone with no business commenting on her private affairs." Colt's voice carried the cold authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I suggest you return home before you say something you might regret." "Don't you dare threaten me," Margaret snapped, her face flushing with anger. "I have every right to protect this community's moral standards, and I know exactly what kind of woman would entertain a man alone in her home after midnight." The insult hung in the air like a slap. Henrietta stepped forward, her own temper finally ignited by weeks of accumulated slights and years of suppressed frustration. "What kind of woman, Mrs. Ashford?" she asked with deceptive calm. "The kind who spent 20 years caring for her dying father? The kind who works honest labor to support herself? Or perhaps you mean the kind who dared to attend a public dance where a gentleman chose to spend his evening in her company?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, clearly unprepared for such direct confrontation from someone she'd always considered safely cowed. "The only scandal here," Henrietta continued, "is a woman who makes it her business to destroy other people's happiness. I suggest you examine your own behavior before presuming to judge mine." Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of purple at Henrietta's defiant response. For a moment, the older woman stood speechless on the doorstep, clearly unprepared for such direct confrontation from someone she'd spent years intimidating into submission. "How dare you?" Margaret finally sputtered. "I came here out of Christian concern for your reputation, and this is how you repay my kindness?" "Kindness?" Henrietta stepped fully into the doorway, her spine straight and her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You've spent years making cruel comments about my appearance, my age, my prospects. You've whispered behind my back and encouraged others to do the same. That's not kindness, Mrs. Ashford, that's cruelty disguised as righteousness. Colt moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. I think the lady has made her position clear, he said with quiet authority. Perhaps it's time for you to return home. But Margaret wasn't finished. Her small eyes glittered with malicious triumph as she played what she clearly considered her winning card. Fine words from a man living under false pretenses. Did you tell her about the federal marshals who've been asking questions about you in Denver, Mr. Carrigan? Or should I say, Mr. Colt Morrison? The name hit like a physical blow. Colt went rigid beside Henrietta, his hand instinctively moving toward his coat pocket. What did you say? Oh, yes, Margaret continued with vicious satisfaction. I have connections beyond this little town. My sister's husband works for the territorial government. Imagine my surprise when I described you to him, and he recognized the name. Colt Morrison, wanted for questioning in connection with fraudulent land deals and the disappearance of federal evidence. Henrietta's world tilted on its axis. First learning that her father had lived an entire hidden life, and now discovering that the man she'd spent the evening falling in love with might be a criminal. Colt, what is she talking about? But Colt's attention was fixed on Margaret with laser intensity. Your brother-in-law wouldn't happen to work for Judge Harrison Blackwood, would he? Margaret's moment of triumph flickered. How do you know about Judge Blackwood? Because he's the corrupt federal judge my brother and I testified against 5 years ago, Colt said grimly. The same man who's been hunting us ever since, using every resource at his disposal to silence anyone who could expose his involvement with wartime profiteering. The revelation sent ice through Henrietta's veins. You're saying this Judge Blackwood is after you? After both of us, apparently. Tom, your father, had documentation of Blackwood's crimes. When Tom disappeared, I thought the evidence had died with him. Colt's expression grew grim as pieces fell into place. But if Blackwood's people have tracked me here, they must believe Tom left something behind. Margaret stepped backward, suddenly looking less certain of her position. I don't know what you're talking about. Judge Blackwood is a respected member of the territorial court. Judge Blackwood is a criminal who spent years covering his tracks, Colt replied flatly. And if you've been feeding him information about my whereabouts, you've made yourself an accessory to his crimes. The accusation drained the color from Margaret's face. He said you were dangerous, that the community needed to be protected. From what? A man trying to honor his dead brother's memory? Colt's voice carried 20 years of accumulated anger. Or from someone who might have evidence of federal corruption? Henrietta's mind was reeling, but one terrible thought crystallized with sudden clarity. Papa's death, she said quietly. The doctor said his heart just gave out. But what? Colt turned to her with growing alarm. What if someone helped it along? The words came out barely above a whisper. He was getting stronger those last few weeks, talking about projects he wanted to complete. Then suddenly, one morning, I found him gone. The implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Colt's face went white with fury. If Blackwood's people killed Tom, you can't prove anything, Margaret interjected desperately. You're just making wild accusations to cover your own crimes. What crimes? Henrietta demanded, rounding on the older woman with newfound fierceness. What exactly is Colt supposed to have done? Margaret's confidence was crumbling rapidly. The judge said there were irregularities in land purchases, missing federal documents. Documents that would have proven Blackwood was selling federal land grants to Confederate sympathizers during the war, Colt explained grimly. Tom and I weren't the criminals, we were the witnesses. Then why are you using a false name? Margaret asked, grasping for solid ground. Because Morrison is my real name. Carrigan was the identity Tom and I took when we went into hiding after the first attempt on our lives. Colt pulled a worn leather wallet from his coat and extracted several documents. Birth certificate, military discharge papers, federal witness protection orders, all in the name of Colt Morrison. Margaret stared at the papers with dawning horror. But the ranch is legally owned by Morrison Holdings, a company I established after the war using money I inherited from our grandmother, the only family wealth that wasn't tainted by our father's war profiteering. Colt's voice carried the weariness of a man tired of senderdom, explaining his choices. I've been building that ranch as a legitimate business while trying to find my brother and keep us both alive. The sound of approaching horses made all three of them freeze. Through the night air came the distinctive jingle of spurs and the creak of leather that spoke of multiple riders moving with purpose. "They're coming," Colt said quietly, his hand moving to his coat with practiced efficiency. "Henrietta, is there a back way out of this house?" "Through the kitchen, but Colt." "No time for explanations. If these are Blackwood's men, they'll kill anyone who might have Tom's evidence." He grabbed her hand urgently. "Where would your father have hidden important papers?" Henrietta's mind raced. "The bookshop. He had a loose board under the counter where he kept emergency money. We need to get there before they do." "I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me what's really happening," Henrietta said firmly, despite the fear clawing at her throat. The sound of horses had stopped, replaced by the ominous quiet of men positioning themselves around the cottage. Margaret looked between Colt and Henrietta with growing panic, clearly realizing she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than small-town gossip. "Judge Blackwood has been systematically eliminating everyone who could testify against his wartime activities," Colt explained rapidly. "Tom's disappearance was supposed to be permanent, but when he surfaced in Sweetwater under an assumed name, it became a loose end that needed tying up. So they killed him? And now they're here for whatever evidence he might have left behind, and for me." Colt's expression was grim but determined. "But they made one mistake. They assumed Tom's daughter would be helpless and ignorant. They don't know about you." A sharp knock echoed through the cottage, far more authoritative than Margaret's earlier summons. A voice called out with the practiced command of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Federal marshals, open the door." Margaret let out a small whimper of fear. "What do we do?" Colt was already moving toward the kitchen, pulling Henrietta with him. "We run, and we get to those papers before they do, because right now they're the only thing that might keep us all alive." But as they reached the back door, the sound of splintering wood from the front of the house told them they were already too late. Heavy boots thundered across the parlor floor, and gruff voices began shouting orders. "Find the woman. Search everything. If the documents are here, I want them found." Through the kitchen window, Henrietta could see dark figures moving through her garden, cutting off their escape route. They were trapped, surrounded by men who'd already killed once to protect their secrets and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. "This way," she whispered, leading Colt toward the root cellar door. "Papa dug this during the Apache troubles. There's a tunnel that leads to the creek bed." As they descended into the musty darkness below her cottage, Henrietta realized her quiet, predictable life was over forever. Whether they survived the night or not, she could never go back to being the invisible spinster who minded her own business and caused no trouble. The woman who danced in a sapphire gown was about to discover just how brave she could be when everything she loved was at stake. The tunnel beneath Henrietta's cottage was narrow and cramped, carved from hard-packed earth and supported by rough wooden beams her father had installed years ago. As they crawled through the suffocating darkness, the sound of their pursuers searching the house above filtered down through the floorboards like distant thunder. "Where does this lead?" Colt whispered, his voice barely audible over the scrape of their bodies against the earthen walls. "About 50 yards to the creek bed," Henrietta replied, fighting to keep panic from her voice. "Papa said it was an old mining shaft that he expanded during the Indian troubles." Behind them, they could hear Margaret's voice rising in hysterical protests as the federal marshals questioned her about their whereabouts. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the terror of a woman who'd finally understood the deadly game she'd been playing. "I don't know where they went," Margaret sobbed. "I just came here to talk sense into that foolish woman. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Search every inch of this place," came the authoritative response. "Check for hidden rooms, loose floorboards, anything that might conceal documents. And find that tunnel. No one just disappears into thin air." Colt cursed softly as boots thundered overhead, moving with systematic precision through the small cottage. "They're professionals, military training, probably ex-cavalry. How many do you think there are?" "At least 6, maybe more, posted around the perimeter." Colt's voice carried the grim assessment of a man who'd learned to count enemies by sound. "Blackwood's not taking any chances this time." They reached the end of the tunnel, where a wooden grate covered the opening to the creek bed. Colt tested it carefully, wincing at the slight squeak of rusted hinges. Through the gaps, they could see the moonlit water trickling over smooth stones, and beyond that, the dark silhouette of Sweetwater's main street. "The general store is about 100 yards upstream," Henrietta whispered, "but crossing open ground. We don't have a choice. Those documents are the only leverage we have." Colt studied the terrain with tactical precision. "Stay low, move fast, and if something happens to me, you get to those papers and head for the territorial capital. Find Sheriff Morrison, he's my cousin, and one of the few lawmen I trust completely." The casual way he spoke of his potential death sent ice through Henrietta's veins. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Henrietta." "No." She turned to face him in the cramped space, her eyes fierce despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I've spent 35 years being careful, being invisible, avoiding trouble. I'm not losing you the same night I found you." Something shifted in Colt's expression. "Tom wrote that you had your mother's stubborn streak. Apparently I have my uncle's too." Despite their desperate circumstances, Colt's mouth quirked upward. "Tom would be proud of how brave you've become." "I'm not brave. I'm terrified." Henrietta's voice shook slightly. "But I'm more afraid of living without answers than I am of dying trying to find them." Colt reached out and touched her face gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her cheek. "When this is over, when we've stopped these men and cleared our names, I want to court you properly, take you to dinner, bring you flowers, ask your permission to walk you home from church." The sweetness of the promise, offered in such a dark moment, brought tears to her eyes. "When this is over, I'd like that very much. Then, let's make sure we both survive to keep that promise." Colt eased the grate open and slipped out into the creek bed, his movements silent despite his size. After scanning the banks for sentries, he helped Henrietta climb out, his strong hands steadying her as she found her footing on the slippery stones. The night air felt shockingly cold after the tunnel's stuffy confines. Above them, lights blazed in her cottage windows as the searchers continued their methodical destruction of her quiet life. The sound of breaking furniture and splintering wood carried clearly across the still air. "They're being thorough," Colt observed grimly. "Won't take them long to find the tunnel entrance." They moved upstream with careful stealth, staying in the creek bed's shadow and pausing frequently to listen for pursuit. The water was shallow but achingly cold, soaking through Henrietta's dancing slippers and numbing her feet within minutes. "There," she whispered, pointing to the back of Hawkins' general store. "The bookshop entrance is around the side." But as they approached their destination, Colt suddenly grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a large boulder. "Wait," he breathed against her ear. Through the darkness, Henrietta could see what had caught his attention: 2 figures stationed near the store's rear entrance, their positions chosen to cover all approaches. The federal marshals had anticipated their destination and laid a trap. "They know about the papers," Colt said quietly. "Someone told them exactly where to look." "Margaret? Or someone else who knew Tom's habits?" Colt's expression was troubled. "Which means they've been watching your father for longer than we thought." The implications were chilling. If Blackwood's people had been monitoring Thomas Bloom for months or even years before his death, they might know every detail of his daily routine, every hiding place, every potential ally. "We need a distraction," Henrietta said, studying the layout with newfound tactical thinking. Something to draw them away from the store. Too dangerous. If they catch you, they won't catch me because I know this town better than they do. Henrietta's voice carried a determination that surprised them both. I've been invisible here for 20 years. It's time to put that to good use. Before Colt could protest, she'd already begun outlining her plan. Give me 10 minutes to get into position. When you hear the church bell ring, that's your signal to move. Henrietta, no, I won't let you. You can't stop me. She met his eyes steadily. This is my fight too now. Those men killed my father, destroyed my home, threatened everything I care about. I won't hide while you face them alone. The argument that followed was conducted in urgent whispers, but Henrietta's mind was made up. She'd spent a lifetime avoiding conflict, deferring to others' judgment, staying safely on the sidelines. But tonight had awakened something fierce and protective in her nature, something that refused to let the people she loved face danger alone. At least take this, Colt said finally, pressing a small derringer into her hand. It's only got 2 shots, but at close range. I know how to use it. Papa taught me when I was 16. Another revelation that seemed to surprise them both, said a woman living alone needed to know how to protect herself. As Henrietta prepared to leave their hiding place, Colt caught her hand one more time. If this goes wrong, if we don't both make it out, we will. But if we don't, I want you to know that tonight has been the best evening of my life. Dancing with you, learning about Tom through your eyes, seeing the woman he raised with such love and pride, it's been worth everything. Henrietta leaned forward and kissed him softly, tasting salt from tears she didn't remember shedding. Save the pretty speeches for when we're safe. I plan to hear a lot more of them. She slipped away into the shadows before he could respond, moving through the familiar streets of Sweetwater with the silent grace of someone who'd learned to be invisible. Behind her, Colt settled into position with the patience of a hunter, his own weapons ready for the confrontation that was coming. The church bell sat silent in its tower, waiting for the signal that would begin the most dangerous gamble of their lives. In 10 minutes, the quiet spinster who'd spent the evening dancing in a sapphire gown would transform once again, this time into a woman willing to risk everything for love and justice. The men who'd underestimated Thomas Bloom's daughter were about to learn the same lesson Margaret Ashford had discovered earlier that evening. Henrietta Bloom was far stronger than anyone imagined, and definitely more dangerous than she looked. As she made her way toward the church, Henrietta thought of her father's journal entry about recognizing treasures hiding in plain sight. Tonight, she would prove that some treasures were worth fighting for, no matter how high the cost. Henrietta moved through Sweetwater's sleeping streets like a ghost, her sapphire gown darkened by creek water and her dancing slippers silent on the packed earth. The town she'd known all her life had become a battlefield, familiar landmarks transformed into tactical obstacles and potential cover. The church stood at the far end of Main Street, its bell tower rising against the star-filled sky like a sentinel. To reach it, she would have to pass within sight of at least 3 posted sentries, but years of being overlooked had taught her how to blend with shadows, how to move without drawing attention. She slipped between buildings, using rain barrels and wood piles for concealment, her heart hammering against her ribs with each careful step. The derringer felt heavy in her pocket, its weight a constant reminder of how far her quiet life had strayed from anything resembling normal. As she neared the church, voices drifted from the direction of her cottage, too distant to make out words, but carrying the harsh cadence of men growing frustrated with their search. They'd found the tunnel by now, which meant Colt's window of opportunity was shrinking rapidly. The church's side door was unlocked, it always was, a testament to Sweetwater's peaceful nature that now seemed almost naive. Henrietta slipped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of beeswax candles and old wood that had comforted her through countless Sunday services. The bell rope hung in the vestry like a lifeline. One strong pull would send bronze notes cascading across the valley, alerting the entire territory that something was amiss. But it would also pinpoint her location for every armed man hunting through the darkness. Through the church's windows, she could see figures moving near the general store. 2 men remained at their posts, while others had joined the search of her cottage. The plan was working, but only if she could time the distraction perfectly. She gripped the rope with both hands, feeling its rough fibers against her palms. In a few moments, she would ring the bell that had called her to worship every Sunday since childhood, but this time it would be a battle cry rather than a call to prayer. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 35 years, she'd sat quietly in these pews, listening to sermons about courage and faith, while living a life defined by caution and fear. Tonight, surrounded by mortal danger, she finally understood what those words really meant. A shadow moved past the window too close to the church for comfort. One of the sentries was expanding his patrol route, drawn perhaps by some instinct that prey might seek sanctuary in holy ground. Henrietta pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as footsteps circled the building. The front door creaked open. "Anyone in here?" a rough voice called out, echoing in the vaulted space. Henrietta remained frozen in the vestry, counting heartbeats as heavy boots moved down the center aisle. The man was being thorough, checking behind pews and in dark corners where someone might hide. "Church is empty, Marshal Kane," the voice called out after what felt like an eternity. "Just the usual religious nonsense. Keep searching. The woman knows these streets better than we do. She could be anywhere." The boots retreated, and the door closed with a soft thump. Henrietta waited another full minute before moving, ensuring the sentry had truly moved on. When she finally emerged from hiding, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the bell rope. Through the window, she could see Colt's dark figure crouched behind the livery stable, waiting for her signal. The men guarding the general store were still in position, but their attention had shifted toward the continuing search of her cottage. This was the moment. One pull of the rope would set everything in motion, either their salvation or their destruction. Henrietta thought of her father's gentle hands writing in his journal, documenting small acts of human kindness while hiding from men who would kill to protect their secrets. She thought of the brother he'd never stopped missing, the family he'd sacrificed to live with honor. She thought of the love that had bloomed in a single evening, fragile as new grass, but strong enough to risk everything to protect. The bell rope felt solid in her hands as she pulled with all her strength. The first bronze note rang out like thunder, shattering the night's silence and echoing off the surrounding mountains. Again and again the bell tolled, each peal a declaration that would wake every soul in Sweetwater and send armed men racing toward the sound. Through the window, she saw the sentries at the general store abandon their posts, running toward the church with weapons drawn. Behind them, Colt's figure sprinted across the open ground, using the distraction to reach the bookshop's rear entrance. But even as relief flooded through her, Henrietta realized she'd made a critical error. The bell's rope mechanism was old and temperamental once started. It couldn't be easily stopped. The bronze voice continued its urgent song, pinpointing her location with deadly accuracy for anyone within miles. Shouts erupted outside as the federal marshals converged on the church. Through the windows, she could see torches and lanterns bobbing through the darkness like angry fireflies, drawing ever closer to her sanctuary. The woman who'd spent her life avoiding attention had just announced her presence to every dangerous man in the territory. Now she had to survive long enough for that gamble to pay off. The church bell continued its relentless tolling as Henrietta abandoned the vestry and ran for the altar, seeking the only hiding place that might offer temporary sanctuary. Behind the ornate wooden structure, shadows pooled deep enough to conceal a desperate woman, but she knew it would only buy her minutes at most. Through the stained glass windows, colored light from approaching torches painted dancing rainbows on the wooden floor, beautiful and terrifying at once. The voices outside grew louder, more coordinated, as the federal marshals organized their approach. "Surround the building, Marshal Kane's voice carried clearly through the night air. "If she's in there, she's trapped. Take her alive, if possible. We need to know what she's learned about the documents." Henrietta pressed herself against the cool stone wall behind the altar, her father's derringer clutched in trembling hands. 2 shots against 6 or more armed men seemed like hopeless odds, but she'd rather die fighting than let them use her as leverage against Colt. The church door exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the sacred space like divine judgment. Heavy boots thundered down the aisle as armed figures poured through the entrance, their weapons glinting in the lamplight they carried. "Check every pew, every corner," Kane commanded. "She's here somewhere." From her hiding place, Henrietta could see their methodical search pattern. These weren't ordinary lawmen. They moved with military precision, covering angles and coordinating their positions like soldiers who'd fought together in more than one war. A shadow fell across the altar as one of the searchers approached her sanctuary. Henrietta held her breath, finger on the derringer's trigger, knowing that discovery meant certain capture or death. The man's boots stopped inches from where she crouched, and she could hear his breathing, steady and controlled. "Marshal Kane," a voice called from near the entrance. "Signal fire on the ridge. Looks like someone's trying to alert the territorial capital." Kane cursed vividly. "How long until our reinforcements arrive?" "Another hour, maybe 2. But if word reaches Sheriff Morrison, then we finish this quickly." Kane's voice grew harder. "Find the woman, get those documents, and eliminate any loose ends. Judge Blackwood wants this mess cleaned up before dawn." The searcher near the altar moved away, drawn by his marshal's urgency. Henrietta allowed herself a shallow breath, but she knew her time was running out. Soon, they would expand their search to include every possible hiding place. A new sound reached her ears, gunfire from the direction of the general store, short, sharp cracks that spoke of a running battle rather than an execution. Colt was alive and fighting, which meant he'd found the documents and was now trying to escape with them. "Movement at the store," someone shouted from outside. "Morrison's shooting his way out the back." Kane's response was immediate and brutal. "Thompson, Williams, get over there and end this. Everyone else, tear this church apart board by board until you find that woman." Half the searchers thundered back out into the night, racing toward the sound of gunfire. That left 3 men to search the church, still overwhelming odds, but better than 6. Henrietta shifted position slightly, trying to get a clear line of sight to the main aisle. As she moved, her foot knocked against something metallic hidden behind the altar. Her fingers found the object in the darkness, a heavy brass candlestick that had rolled into the shadows during some past service. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than harsh words. The remaining searchers had reached the front pews, their systematic approach bringing them inevitably closer to her hiding place. In moments, they would round the altar and discover her cowering in the shadows like a frightened rabbit. But as Henrietta gripped the candlestick and prepared to make her desperate stand, a new sound reached her ears. Church bells were ringing throughout the valley, not just Sweetwater's bronze voice, but the answering calls from 3 other towns within earshot. Her signal had worked beyond her wildest hopes, alerting every settlement within miles that trouble had come to their peaceful corner of Colorado. More voices erupted outside as riders thundered into town from multiple directions. The territorial sheriff's deputies were responding to the alarm, along with ranch hands and townspeople who'd been awakened by the clanging bells. "We're blown," one of the searchers said urgently. "Time to go." "Not without the woman," Kane replied grimly. "She's the only leverage we have left." But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching riders grew louder. Whatever documents Colt had found in the bookshop, whatever evidence Thomas Bloom had hidden for 20 years, it would soon be in the hands of legitimate lawmen rather than Blackwood's corrupt agents. The searcher closest to the altar raised his lamp high, its light beginning to penetrate the shadows where Henrietta crouched. In seconds, her hiding place would be exposed. She gripped the brass candlestick tighter and said a prayer her father had taught her as a child, not for her own safety, but for the courage to face whatever came next with the same dignity he'd shown throughout his hidden, honorable life. The lamp's glow crept closer to Henrietta's hiding place behind the altar when the church doors burst open once again. But this time, the voice that rang out carried the authority of legitimate law rather than corrupt power. "Federal marshals, this is Sheriff Morrison with a territorial warrant. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." The sound of Colt's cousin's voice sent relief flooding through Henrietta's body so powerfully that she nearly sobbed aloud. Through the gaps in the altar's carved wooden screen, she could see the federal marshals turning toward this new threat, their plans crumbling as quickly as their isolation had been broken. "Sheriff Morrison," Marshal Kane called out with false heartiness, "we're conducting official federal business here. Judge Blackwood sent us to apprehend dangerous fugitives." "Judge Blackwood is under arrest in Denver as of 6 hours ago," Sheriff Morrison replied coldly. "Along with half his staff. Seems someone provided the territorial governor with very compelling evidence of federal corruption and murder." Kane's face went white in the lamplight. "That's impossible. Your intelligence is 20 years out of date. The war's over, Marshal, and so is your judge's protection." Sheriff Morrison stepped further into the church, flanked by 6 armed deputies. "Now drop those weapons before this gets any messier." The standoff stretched like a taut wire for several heartbeats. Then Kane made the mistake of reaching for his sidearm, and the church erupted in gunfire. Henrietta pressed herself against the stone wall as bullets whined overhead, shattering windows and splintering wooden pews. When the smoke cleared, Kane lay motionless near the pulpit, while his surviving men knelt with their hands raised. Sheriff Morrison's deputies moved efficiently to secure the scene, their actions speaking of men accustomed to dealing with corruption at the highest levels. "Miss Bloom," Sheriff Morrison called out gently, "my cousin Colt is outside, safe and unharmed. You can come out now." Henrietta emerged from behind the altar on unsteady legs, the brass candlestick still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. The church that had been her sanctuary looked like a battlefield, with bullet holes scarring the walls where she'd worshipped every Sunday since childhood. Sheriff Morrison was a lean man, with graying hair and kind eyes that reminded her powerfully of Colt. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry about the damage to your church. The territorial government will see that everything's restored." "I don't care about the building," Henrietta said, her voice hoarse with relief. "Is Colt really right here?" She turned to find Colt filling the doorway, his clothes torn and a bandage wrapped around his left arm, but alive and whole. In his uninjured hand, he carried a leather satchel that seemed to glow with significance in the lamplight. Henrietta ran to him without caring who might be watching, and his good arm came around her with desperate strength. For a long moment, they simply held each other while the chaos of the night settled into something approaching peace. "The documents?" Sheriff Morrison asked quietly. Colt nodded toward the satchel. "Everything Tom collected over 20 years. Names, dates, financial records, correspondence between Blackwood and Confederate agents. Enough to hang half the territorial government and free the other half from his influence. And proof that Thomas Bloom was murdered? Medical records showing traces of digitalis poisoning, along with a letter Tom wrote to be opened only in the event of his death. He suspected someone was slowly killing him but couldn't prove it." Colt's arm tightened around Henrietta. He spent his last weeks making sure his evidence would survive, even if he didn't. The revelation that her father had known he was being murdered, had faced his death with such courage and forethought, brought fresh tears to Henrietta's eyes. But these were tears of pride rather than grief, pride in a man who'd given his life to expose corruption and protect the innocent. "What happens now?" she asked. Sheriff Morrison exchanged a look with his cousin. "Now we deliver this evidence to the territorial governor and watch Judge Blackwood's empire crumble. There'll be trials, investigations, probably some political upheaval, but the immediate danger is over." As they prepared to leave the church, Henrietta noticed Margaret Ashford huddled in one of the back pews, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine terror. The older woman looked up as they passed, her face streaked with tears. "I didn't know," Margaret whispered. "I swear I didn't know what I was helping them do." Colt paused, studying the woman who'd unwittingly helped orchestrate the evening's violence. Judge Blackwood was skilled at using people's weaknesses against them. Pride, greed, the need to feel important. He knew exactly which buttons to push. "What will happen to me?" "That's up to the territorial courts," Sheriff Morrison replied, "but cooperation and testimony about how Blackwood's people recruited you might weigh in your favor." 3 hours later, as dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold, Henrietta stood in the ruins of her cottage with Colt beside her. The federal marshals had destroyed nearly everything in their search, but somehow that seemed less important than it should have. "I'm sorry about your home," Colt said softly. "It's just a building." Henrietta leaned against his uninjured shoulder, watching the sunrise paint Sweetwater in gentle light. "Papa always said home wasn't a place, it was the people who loved you. Then I'd like to offer you a new home, if you'll have it." Colt turned to face her, his storm-grey eyes serious but warm. "My ranch has plenty of room for a library, and I know a lady with excellent taste in books who might help me stock it properly." The proposal, offered amid the wreckage of her old life, felt like the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. "Are you asking me to marry you, Colt Morrison?" "I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life proving that Tom was right about late-blooming flowers being the most beautiful of all." Henrietta's answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted like tears and hope and the promise of adventures yet to come. Around them, Sweetwater stirred to life under a new dawn, and the woman who'd been called an ugly spinster discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with the courage to dance when the music called your name.